I was raised in a family where things French were very important. They were very important, almost in an unspoken way. It was like the air that we breathed. You don't really talk too much about it, you don't really think too much about it, but it's there, and it informs who you are to the point that it makes your existence possible. It's impossible to understand France as a country. What is tourism? Tourism is an incredibly advanced form of capitalism. A society without memory is destined to collapse. Why is our world seem to be veering in the direction of a great deal of violence? In my opinion, we feel very insecure in our lives. We just feel like we're kind of tossed around in a choppy storm. We don't know which way is up. We're kind of grasping for whatever we can get a hold of. My family, we were Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe, and we survived World War II essentially in Nice. We're hidden by friends who we know from Paris who have a place down there. It's one thing to recognize that institutions are flawed. It's another to desire to scrap them entirely.
One thing that concerns me is the reality that governments and institutions are inherently less sovereign than they previously were due to things like the IMF and the World Bank.
History is of vital importance to humanity.
I agree.
Period.
My name is Neo Harder, aka the Farm Boy. You have joined Farm Boy Meets the World. I am joined by Professor David Moak. Professor David Moak attended Princeton University, where he received his PhD in history. But before that, he received a Bachelor's of Arts in History and Economics. Is that correct, Professor Moak?
Correct.
Yes, that is correct. So, I'm very excited for our conversation today. I've been thinking about it for the past couple of days, past couple of weeks, as a matter of fact. I've been thinking about some questions, and I have some stuff that already prepared, but I'm sure that we're going to go ahead and expand on some things. So the first question that I'd really like to ask you, Professor Moak, is why do you think that people ought to care about global studies? Why should students, why should individuals who maybe aren't involved at university but have an interest be concerned with global studies?
It's a great question, and there are potentially many good answers. I'll maybe just provide a couple. I think global studies is an extremely important field of study for a few reasons. The first being that, as I have developed as, a scholar, teacher, whatever it may be, I've become more and more aware of the fact that it's impossible to understand even the seemingly most insignificant thing in one place without investigating how it is tied to events elsewhere, right? This kind of interconnection that we live with today is kind of the focus of global studies, the center of the discipline. And it's absolutely vital for developing a holistic understanding of whatever it is you may be interested in. I myself am trained as a French historian.
Right.
So, obviously that's where I direct my gaze. That's where my interests are, professionally. And that's where I do my research. And yet, I've become, again, more and more aware of the fact that it's impossible to understand France as a country. It's impossible to understand Paris as a city, or Marseille, or Lyon, or Nice, without placing these, cities in this country into a global context, so that you can see those connections. You can see, how what happens in one place reverberates and has consequences in another. And this is what global studies really does for us. I can think of, plenty of examples of this. I work on Nice, which is a city in the Mediterranean, which, nowadays is most famous for being, the capital of the French Riviera. It's kind of a tourist destination, sunshine, beaches, palm trees, all of that lovely stuff. And one of the things that I'm very interested in is how Nice came to develop along those lines, to become this place, how the city was created to appeal to people, particularly elites from across Europe who would be originally going to Nice during the winter, vacationing because of the mild weather.
Right.
And, so one of the things that I was doing when I was researching my dissertation was, reading a lot of archival documents produced by, these foreign consuls, representatives of different countries, primarily in Europe, but also in, Africa and the Near East, who were, present in Nice and who would kind of serve the communities that they represented there. So reading a bunch of these consular papers, I became intimately aware of the fact that, what was happening in this, comparatively small town was being affected by things very far afield, whether it was the disruption of grain shipments coming out of the Black Sea from the Crimean War in the 1850s, or whether it was the sort of wars in the Americas, north, south, and otherwise affecting, trade flows, and the circulation of people also, not to mention that the Mediterranean itself is this place of intense circulation where you have, folks crossing paths constantly. And so I got sensitized to this issue through my research. And the other thing that global studies does, in addition to highlighting those connections between, places, events, people that seemingly have little in common, is that it kind of gets us to move beyond the traditional divisions that we work within at the university. We have been trained to think of ourselves as, anthropologists or sociologists or historians or chemists or biologists, whatever it may be. And that's useful to a certain extent, but I think this kind of specialization goes too far in the modern university. Global studies kind of works against it. It says you can't understand things if you don't pay attention to, first of all, those connections, but also if you limit yourself in terms of the kind of approaches you take. You can't understand reality unless you blend all of this stuff together. You can't develop a holistic picture unless you are, working with the lens of an economist and an anthropologist and a historian all at once. And trying to generate knowledge and understand from whatever perspective is useful and that you can bring to bear on that material. So this is my, I guess, pitch for global studies, why I think it's so important. And of course, it's a discipline that allows us through these means to develop and contextualize understanding of ourselves, the world in which we live, how we're interacting with it. It's a discipline that doesn't stop in the classroom, but that kind of comes with us wherever we go, whatever profession we may pursue later on in life, I think.
Wow, that was a lot, and that was a perfect answer to the question. You addressed all of the tenets of global studies that I was really hoping that you would touch on, and it was perfect. I did want to expand on it a little bit. You described the world using Nice as an example, and using the present day as an example as well. That's very interconnected. But I'm wondering, just based on your research and based on what you've seen, if that's been the norm, if the world has always been connected in this way, where Nice, what happens in Crimea, for example, has such an intense impact on a place like Nice, which of course Crimea is actually is relatively close to Nice. It's not super far, but I guess the question is, has the world always been disconnected? And if not, can you draw us a picture of what the world looked like before it may have been like this?
I mean, personally, in some sense, I do think that the world has always been connected in some way. But that doesn't mean that the connections were always easy, that the sort of effects of what happened in one place would be felt immediately or intensely in another.
When you say that connections aren't easy, do you mean primitive accumulation and forceful interactions and things like that? Or what types of connections do you mean that are difficult?
Yeah, I mean, any kind of human connection, whether it be in the realm of, politics, imperial sort of empire building, imperial projects, trade, religion, whatever it may be, we have to be aware of the fact that we live in a world nowadays where these things can take place, these connections can be made almost instantaneously. I mean, not when it comes to empire building, obviously that's a more long drawn out process, but in the sort of a realm of civil society, it's very, very easy, to get on your phone right now and to talk to somebody in Zimbabwe,
Right, right, of course.
Now, this facility of communication and interconnection is something that's very modern and very new. But the interconnection itself isn't, I think. For example, there's still trade, there's still, the spreading of religion, there's still the spreading of languages and ways of viewing the world over centuries and millennia in Afro-Eurasia. But in the absence of things like automobiles, trains, airplanes, of course, that happens at a much slower pace. There are certain resistances that need to be overcome. They are partially, geographical, but also, chronological and spatial. How do you create sustained communication in those sorts of conditions where you don't have the telephone, where you don't have the train, where the fastest way to travel is by horse, right?
The Mongols did it well, but
exactly.
I suppose not. I suppose not everyone can be the Mongols, right?
Yeah. So there's an interesting. I conceptualized human history in these terms. There's sort of the initial kind of emergence from Africa, East Africa, where, of course, we're all from. This sort of spreading out across Afro-Eurasia, eventually, also into the Americas due to the ability to traverse the Bering Strait, right, at certain points because of the climate. And with this spreading, right, the interconnection remains there, our common humanity remains there, but we start to evolve and develop in very different ways, again, because of the difficulty of sustained communication, in the absence of modern technologies, okay? And then what we have with the modern age is the intensification, or I should say the re-intensification of those connections as a result of technologies of various kinds, transportation, communication, whatever it may be, that allow for people to start kind of coming together in a sense once more. And so it's, I view it almost as, it's sort of like a curve.
Yeah, I was actually I had a very similar visual myself actually, of kind of what you could describe maybe as epochs of high connection and then lower epochs of lower connection. And one thing that you mentioned in your class actually is that people, I suppose, don't often, the people overlook sometimes, is how that connection can actually be facilitated by something as simple, maybe not as simple, but something such as the climate. And we were talking about in class, for example, the little ice age, the mini ice age, which, if my memory serves, occurred between like 1300 and like 1700 at that time period. And that would have been an era of minimal connection, for example. Minimal to the relative to the time period after, maybe not before as much, because we're looking at medieval ages then. But I can certainly see what you're saying about the climate and things like that facilitating connection. It's
an excellent point. Again, when it comes to interconnection, there are certain peoples who have an advantage, who can play the role of facilitators because of perhaps climatic conditions in which they live,
right?
Like, the flat grasslands of Central Asia, the steppe, and the horses, and the kind of mobile nomadic culture that generated.
Right.
And then there are also, climates, geographies that are less conducive, that present more by way of barriers and obstacles. And those could be things like, land formations, but they could also be part of broader long-term cycles of climate change, right? Like the Little Ice Age, which you're absolutely right, had a dramatic effect on the ability to communicate, not even just across long distances, but even quite locally.
Even locally,
Think about the freezing of rivers, the freezing of the River Seine. How do you get wheat to the capital city of Paris, right? Obviously, it's not grown in Paris; it's an urban place. There are only so many ways of transporting materials. Horsepower is the primary kind of land-based way of transporting things. But ultimately, the cheapest and most effective way of transporting things, people, goods, ideas, whatever it may be, was the water. Right? And what happens when the water becomes solid?
It's intraversible.
You can't use it anymore.
No longer can use it, right?
And so this is, something to keep in mind. And you're right. It's a kind of process of, waxing and waning, this sort of moments of more intensity and facility of communication, and others where, there are more obstacles and more barriers.
Yeah. I thought it's so funny because you brought up a few great examples, and I thought of a few more myself. I was thinking of Peter Bruegel, the Flanders. I think he's from Flanders, that area, the Belgian area, Netherlandish area. He's a painter. For anyone who doesn't know, I would highly suggest looking him up. But he has this painting. I believe it's him. It depicts Antwerp when it's frozen, and there's a lake or the river beside Antwerp. I forget the name of the river, but he talks about that time period being one of basically extreme isolation from the rest of the world. And Antwerp, which, as you know, which you taught us in the class, which I found very interesting, is Holland and Belgium a little bit prior to that time period was the financial capital of the world. Right, it had the stock exchange there, and then just a few years later, with the mini ice age, you see the area become completely isolated. Mm-hmm. So those are perfect examples of how climate can affect people and stuff like that, and having a reverberating effect throughout the whole world.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's just one factor among others.
Yeah,
right?
It's one factor
and this is kind
others.
of the great thing about global studies. Again, I'm not a climatologist.
Right,
I wouldn't pretend to know how to process the data related to sort of long-term climatic patterns and do that kind of complex work. Mm-hmm. But I can, sort of take the knowledge from secondary sources. I can incorporate it into my work. And I can use it, again, as just one tool among many to understand in a totality what's going on, in whatever I'm studying at that moment.
What is a student of global studies, what is their most efficient tool? Yeah, I guess that's like my question. What tool can a global studies student employ that'll ensure that they are the best that they can be, the best student they can be, the best understanding of the subject, I suppose I could say?
Personally, I think, it's about having a few maybe characteristics or qualities that you actively work on and that you actively cultivate. Of course, there are certain things that just need to be learned. It's hard to study anything if you don't speak a couple languages, right, or read them at least.
Yeah.
So there are limits in place. There are just certain things that you have to do, right, that will make it possible for you to be, perform at a very high level within this discipline. But there are also just characteristics of mind and personality that I think are really, really important. Curiosity being, foremost among them, and openness. An openness to unexpected answers to the questions that you're posing. Often, we're trained to ask a question with the idea that, there is a specific answer and we're setting out to find that answer and prove that answer. And, that's useful in some regards in keeping your kind of research focused, but you also have to be open to the unexpected. The stuff that you didn't predict. And this is something that I've had to work on myself because of how I was trained, as a historian, really. So I think this openness is vitally important also, along with the curiosity. And then finally, there's this desire for synthesis, right? Again, synthesis of different types of information, different sources, and also different approaches from different disciplines. To me, the great creativity of the human mind is in its capacity to synthesize things, bring them together, and demonstrate connections, right? And through those connections, we generate knowledge in some sense. This is how I've always kind of approached my own studies, and I think this is what global studies forces us to do, to be synthetic in how we approach things, to recognize that there are all of these different factors, all of these moving pieces going on at once, and we need to kind of find a way to show how they're related.
Yeah, I understand. So I want to switch gears just a little bit and address your work on Nice in particular and your revolutionary France, your work on revolutionary France and France in general. Before we go ahead and dive into some of the details, do you think you can describe to me and the viewers and all the people listening how you became interested in the subject of revolutionary France? And I guess we could even go with history and stuff like that, and then we can move into details with Nice and then start unpacking what Nice is all about.
I think history is of vital importance to humanity.
I agree.
Period.
And
I always use this little, thought experiment to demonstrate, why I think it is of such vital importance. I always say to people, imagine, maybe you had some kind of serious head trauma. You wake up the next morning after this happens, and you literally have no memory. You have no memory whatsoever. Imagine waking up in those circumstances. You would be extremely disoriented. You would be extremely confused. You would be terrified. You wouldn't even know who you yourself were. There would be an absolute collapse of your kind of mental architecture in the absence of memory, right? And this is true of societies as it's true of the individual. A society without memory is destined to collapse, implode upon itself in some sense. It's going to head towards chaos, right? And in many ways, that's what we as historians are. We're the sort of creators of memory. And I say the creators of memory because we know that memory, even on the individual level, is about creation. We don't remember everything that happens.
Right.
It would be impossible. It would be counterproductive. Our brain is constantly processing information to form memories. Almost
synthesizing in a way, very, very in a parallel way to how global studies as a discipline works.
And this is what we do as scholars as well. There's a mass of information, data points, if you will, jumbled out there in the universe. And our job as historians is to try to make sense of that, decide what's kind of worth remembering in some sense, and what isn't, what is important and what's less important, what it is that we think makes us who we are, and then what is, relatively minor. And so it's an absolutely vital function in society. One that sadly is often disparaged and discouraged in the 21st century.
You said a few things that made my mind automatically jump, and one of them was the function of history being almost, as you will, a kind of like a guide, if you will, when used properly for knowing what has and has not worked in the past. But what automatically made me jump was the fact that it can be very easily manipulated. And you can see that not only can it be manipulated, but history in and of itself can be just put to the wayside if someone doesn't want to acknowledge past failures. And that actually, we're veering a little bit away from revolutionary France, and I promise we'll come back to that subject, but you got me going now. And so I'm interested in what your take is on maybe some of the historical mistakes that you're seeing now that maybe have been made in the past and probably should have been learned from just based off of the function of history. There's a lot, so there's a lot of stuff happening right now. And I guess what I'm looking for in particular is what you're feeling about maybe the state of democracy and maybe the state of authoritarianism and across the world. And that this is what my research interests are. So please let me know.
I mean, great questions. First of all, I'll acknowledge the truth of what you said. History, really like any area of knowledge production, is prone to abuses. Whether it be abuse through neglect or abuse through manipulation. Again, knowledge is something that is generated. That is created, just as memory is generated and is created. There are sort of these data points, this raw material that we work with, but the raw material, without our bringing this sort of analytical lens to it, isn't knowledge in some sense because it's unorganized, it's chaotic, it's difficult to make sense of and process, right? And when you have that element of bringing your kind of intellect to bear on the raw material, so to speak, trying to organize it, trying to make sense of it, there is an inherent risk of manipulation, right? Data is not objective in some sense. Talk to an economist and they'll say this: you can make data sets say different things depending on the questions that you ask and depending on the models that you use to generate the answers. Right? And so this is not something that's specific to history. It's an issue that all thinkers, professors, researchers have to wrangle with over the course of their careers. And this is as you said, something that is a cause for concern, not just within the university, but also in our broader world, the world in which we live, as we look around us and, see what's going on and, wonder why that might be, how it might be related to the neglect or manipulation of certain types of information, right? To, let's say serve a political purpose or a moral purpose of some kind. And we do, this is something that we think about. History is constantly engaging with the present and thinking about how the present is made by the past. And so as the present changes, we're kind of revising our vision of the past as well and thinking about these two things in relationship to each other.
Yeah, you're right.
And, and for this reason, a lot of historians also are kind of journalists. They write, articles in kind of popular, press like, the New Yorker or something along the New York Times, because they want to, interrogate that connection between what's happening now and what happened back then, whenever back then is for them. And, you're right. One of the things that has been at the forefront of a lot of historians and scholars kind of thinking in general nowadays in sort of, as they're interrogating the connections between the present and the past, is the rise of authoritarianism. Why is our world seem to be veering in the direction of a great deal of violence? Violence of various kinds in the form of traditional warfare, sure, but also non-traditional warfare, violence of other types even. When we think of violence, we think of, physical attack, but it's possible to be violent in other ways. Sociologists will call this symbolic violence, the violence of language, of stereotyping, of kind of pigeonholing people, putting them in a box, and the sort of violence that this does to us as human beings. And so why is it that our world is moving in this direction of increased violence, it seems, where people are feeling forced to kind of choose camps and face off against others in ways that, at times can feel reminiscent of, what was going on, in the 1930s with the rise of authoritarian nationalisms, extremism of one kind or another, whatever it may be, how this was also related to feelings of kind of societal fracture and breakdown. I think that's a commonality also in the year 2024 and the sort of 1930s. A lot of this desire or this drive towards violence and fighting is caused by the fact, in my opinion, that we feel very insecure in our lives. It could be economically insecure, as professions that once were sort of treated well or kind of degraded in some sense, or maybe once institutions that had been cornerstones of our society are challenged in fundamental ways, like the university, for example, which has certainly been under attack from various angles for many years. We just feel like we're kind of being tossed around in a choppy storm-thrashed sea, and we don't know which way is up. We're kind of grasping for whatever we can get a hold of, and it's this kind of insecurity that breeds, I think, the sort of anger, right? The anger and the need to find an enemy somehow. And this is, classic 1930s, economic collapse, most obviously the devastation of war, the feeling that people had of not knowing which way was up. And this is, the classic instance in which you get, the impulse to scapegoat, to find the enemy, to blame someone for what's going on or to blame groups for what's going on, and use that to justify violence. And again, it could be physical violence, or it could just be the violence of degrading language and stereotyping and building barriers between people on the basis of perceived difference.
Yeah. You said a lot of things that made me jump in that one. And one of the things that really made me think was this kind of social accountability factor that we're talking about. And I think it is a little bit of a cause and effect relationship. And maybe I don't know if I'm using the right terminology here, but it's certainly bilateral, and it's not just one direction. Because I see you use the university system, for example, a pillar of like society at one point, and it's lost in some senses. It's lost that stance it had, but it's not. I wouldn't say that it's not completely undeserving in some senses, because you see things like the failure of the government to protect students during like the 2008 and 2009 recession, and as an effect, all of our prices for colleges have increased massively, and you see anger with this. You see what I mean? And so you are perfectly right in the sense that, and you've illuminated for me the sense that, yeah, there's a certain amount of it is economic. Tangential reasons, I could say, like maybe an economic collapse, but it certainly has to do with in my opinion, the reception of things like that and the governments that are tasked with managing these sorts of difficulties. Now, what you said that was also extremely interesting for me, which I want to touch on, is this new era of violence that we're seeing. And I'm wondering what you think about Samuel Huntington's contribution to academia when he says that this new era of violence is going to be based on culture, and it's going to be a cultural war. What do you think about that?
Mm-hmm. So, in many ways, I mean, I can kind of answer both questions at once, I think, because in a way I think that they're related to each other. First of all, I'll say, when I talk about people feeling insecure and that insecurity breeding anger, I don't do so with the aim of disparaging that those feelings or discrediting them.
No,
I think it's very normal and very natural for humans to need a feeling of stability.
This is what the social contract is all about.
And that it makes sense when that's removed, whether it's through economics or politics or war or whatever it may be, that they start freaking out, for lack of a better term, lashing out also. Yeah. Okay. And for that reason, that, anger and the confusion is understandable. And the fact that it would be directed towards institutions is also understandable. Yeah. And, that could be the university, it could be a government, it could be, a religious institution, whatever it may be. Mm-hmm. The issue is, while the feelings of anger and uncertainty are justified in some sense, and the criticism can be justified, you don't want to end up in a situation where you're throwing the baby with the bathwater, right? Throwing out the baby with the bathwater. It's one thing to recognize that institutions are flawed, that they're maybe failing in their mission in some sense, and wanting to reform them, right? It's another to desire to scrap them entirely, right? And that impulse can be, dangerous. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have a purpose and a place at times, but it's something that, has to be very well thought out because of how radical it is, right? And so, I'm actually quite sympathetic towards directing criticism at institutions, but not with the aim of destroying them or discrediting them, but with the aim of reforming them, right? That, I think, is of vital importance, and that's something that we should all be engaged in, whether we're in a university or not, whether we work in, a sort of academic discipline or not. This is our fundamental, I think, not just right, but obligation as humans trying to live thoughtful lives, right? And trying to be just unto ourselves and unto others at the same time. And this kind of, leads me into the, addressing Samuel Huntington's argument about, civilizations, cultures being at the source of conflict. I think that that's not true. I personally think that, and again, this goes back to the issue of scapegoating, that one of the things that people like to do is they like to try to say that our feelings of insecurity and our feelings of suffering are the fault of someone else, right? It's not the fault of the institutions that are governing you or the people in power who maybe need to be challenged and the institutions need to be reformed. It's not their fault. It's that that you're being kind of hostile, engaged in a hostile way by people who are somehow different from you, culturally, religiously, linguistically, whatever it may be. And I think that ultimately that's a technique for dividing folks and using and preventing them from using their sort of critical perspective on the real source of the problem, right? Which is the reform at home that needs to take place. So it's a great way to distract folks, right? It's not that our values are topsy-turvy. It's not that people are treating people poorly and that there's no accountability in government or institutions of one kind or another. No, that's not the problem. The problem is those people over there. Right, and if you can get folks riled up enough and get them to buy that narrative, they stop looking at those institutions, right, and what needs to be changed in them.
This is what you say makes me think very, very intensely about what's happening in the Middle East right now with Israel and Palestine, and I for one definitely think that the Israeli government and the leader Benjamin Netanyahu, for example, is an exemplar of a government that needs to be reformed. and needs to maybe stop employing so much scapegoating in this situation. Now, what I think is interesting is what made me think about, or what you just made me think about, is the responsibility of nations, of governments to take that lead in terms of directing public opinion, in terms of reforming themselves, in terms of kind of fighting against this unnecessary culture war. Now, one thing that concerns me is the reality that governments and institutions are inherently less sovereign than they previously were, due to things like the IMF and the World Bank, right? So can you talk to me about how that dynamic playing into all of this needs to be considered?
That's an excellent point. You hit the nail on the head. It's one thing to reform institutions, let's say in the places where you live or the country or whatever it may be, or religious institutions, which can be much more kind of global in scope. But it's another thing to think that that's going to solve the problem outright. That's part of the process. These institutions are translators in local conditions of forces and impulses and pressures that are global, right? And often these forces and impulses and pressures can be overwhelming.
Yeah.
And so what do you do in that kind of case? I mean, it's hard to know. It's hard to know what the path forward is. I think this kind of reform needs to be sort of attacked from maybe two different directions. On the one hand, civil society. One of the great things that modern technology has allowed for is the creation of a kind of global civil society.
Like a watch car, like a watch corps, if you will.
Yeah, or perhaps in some sense the idea, you remember we talked about Immanuel Kant and his idea of the critical use of reason through the press. Well, this is now something that, because of technology, is capable of taking place on a nearly instantaneous global scale. And the creation of a kind of global critical reason is potentially something that could emerge from that and could be used to exert pressure for kind of, against these global forces, I think. So that's kind of one prong from which I would attack it. Of course, there are risks as well. Technology is also used for misinformation and disinformation and lying, and so there needs to be a way of kind of parsing the truth and separating the wheat from the chaff, the true from the false. Obviously, the distinction is not that simple. Right. There are multiple true perspectives to something. There are multiple valid analyses, but there are also things that can be recognized as untruths, right, that are based on fabrication, and we need a way to kind of separate those two things. The other direction that I think we need to attack this problem from is one of global governance. This is something that I'm from Delaware, so I'll give a little shout out to Joe Biden here, who was our senator for decades before becoming vice president and president. One of the things that he, at least early on in his tenure, started to get right and started to recognize in a way that maybe previous presidents hadn't. For example, when he was interested in, putting pressure on other governments, or at least, the United States collaborating in putting pressure on governments to have a universal minimum corporate tax.
Yeah.
Now, you might think, why is that important, right? Why does that matter?
Let's get into this, please.
Well, it's because companies, multinational companies, use the sort of divergence between corporate tax rates to hold governments hostage. And say, well, if you want us to pay taxes here, what we're going to do is we're just going to leave and set up shop somewhere else where they say we don't have to pay taxes.
Right.
And this is one of the ways that large, extremely profitable, extremely wealthy individuals and corporations have avoided contributing to the upkeep of societies across the globe, whether it be just paying enough their fair share in terms of financing infrastructure, financing education, financing healthcare, right? This is one of the ways that corporations have played a role in kind of dismantling the welfare state, because they say, well, if you want us to pay, we're just going to leave.
Right.
And Biden was trying to do something about that. And I think that was a very promising sign, and something that, hopefully future leaders will take as a kind of, signpost for the road that we should be sort of following in the years to come.
I think you made so many amazing points in that entire thing. And one thing that I'm just going to draw off the very end here that it makes so much sense is, you see, here in the United States, we have the Federal Reserve, which is the central accountability mechanism for the rest of the banking system, our finance system. And you see continuity with the Federal Reserve being able to control interest rates and things like that. But you don't see that on a global scale as much. And that contribution that Biden is making by having that continuity, so there is less manipulation available, or opportunities for manipulation that are available. I agree with that very much. How do you think that Biden? Do you think that Biden has proved efficient in handling the crisis as of right now in Israel and Palestine? This is obviously a loaded topic. We can come back to it.
I think he's done some good things and some bad things. Or, to avoid that moral language, I think he's been effective in certain domains and less effective in others. And you're right, it's a loaded topic. And it's also a topic that has captured our attention because of how much media attention there is. And, I don't want to imply that it's not rightful. It is rightful. It is just that the media should be paying attention. There are lots of innocent people dying, right, who have, no reason to be subjected to the sorts of things that they're living through, to the types of suffering that they're being exposed to the lives that are being lost. And, we need to face that head on and grapple with that. Biden has done some good things in that direction. But he's also, at other times maybe neglected to pursue policies that personally I think would be good, or to, use language that I would think would be useful. So, ultimately that's a question that, for me, I think is a little difficult to answer without getting into kind of my personal political beliefs.
Yes, I understand.
But I think that the good thing about Biden, and I think that this is something that hopefully a lot of folks have recognized, is that the guy, like any person, has all sorts of flaws, personal and otherwise. His family has also been on display for a number of reasons at various points.
Unfortunately.
I think the one thing that can be said about Biden in terms of his diplomacy, in terms of his domestic politics, is that he, at the very least, seems to have a moral compass and a sense of what is just in some way, what is not. He wants to do well, and he wants to do good. And I think that is a major, attribute of his, something that we can kind of put in the positive side of the balance sheet. He's a sort of decent person. At least this is kind of what I've felt over the years that I've known him. In Delaware and on the national stage. And so although I might disagree with what he does, I don't think it comes from a malicious place.
Like licentious. I understand.
Yeah.
So what you said earlier, I wanted to address the accountability mechanism that is the global press and things like that. I was reading recently that Benjamin Netanyahu and his administration in Israel, and we're going to move on from this subject in a minute, I promise. A few more questions. That the Netanyahu administration is actively repressing some media agencies like Al Jazeera, for example, and a few other ones. And that concerns me because I think that these, although they can be manipulated, I think that following John Stuart Mill's logic, it would make more sense to have as much free speech as possible, as much data as possible, because at the end of the day, the truth will, I believe the truth will prevail. And I think it's more of it's a failure to uphold the democratic standard and the liberal standard that Israel is supposed to be exemplifying. And this makes me think about the rise of authoritarianism again. And I don't know why this is such a fascinating topic to me, but it's an extremely fascinating topic, and I'm concerned about it. I really am. And one thing that I was reading, just bear with me here, I want to hear what you have to think about this. One thing that I was reading, for example, about this, what I call a rise of authoritarianism and a lack of social and political accountability, is things like in California, we see that recently, I was reading some articles this morning the California legislature has taken it upon themselves to stop meeting in the previously assigned places, like the Sacramento, the capital, where the things are public and things like that, and they've rescinded to a private spaces, and there's a lot less transparency in Californian government. And then this is happening because this is a symptom of California being dominated by one party. And so there's a lack of accountability there. And I'm seeing that here, and I'm seeing that, which is supposed to be an extremely democratic place, right? I'm seeing that in Israel, and I'm seeing that in India, for example, with the Modi administration, leading what I would consider an ethnic cleansing of the Muslim population and the Sikh population, and favoring the Hindu population. So what do you think about this lack of the global press and things like that, and this lack of transparency?
I also think it's deeply troubling.
Yeah.
I think the idea of shutting down a press like Al Jazeera because you don't like the particular narrative that they're providing or the analysis, the kind of editorial line, is deeply troubling.
Deeply troubling.
But it's not something that's specific to Israel, as you said.
No.
We do this here. We now have this word fake news, right, that is bandied about constantly to discredit the press. A very, very respectable, very, very rigorous, very, very good sources of information will be, disparaged using these terms. And you find this really across the globe right now. And this is part of a systematic campaign of disinformation and misinformation, trying to get people to be so distrustful of everything around them that they don't know what is up and what is down, what is left and what is right in some sense, and that they can't distinguish what is, information that is valid, although, kind of hewing maybe to a particular line or a particular interpretation, and then that information that is just fabricated, right? And so I think it's deeply troubling. Al Jazeera may have, again, a line that the government does not like in the state of Israel, and it may be perfectly legal to shut this news agency down within the sort of kind of legal framework that exists within the state and the state's boundaries. But I think that it is a sign of the fact that there is an increasing desire to shut down perspectives, even ones that are based on valid information, if they don't align with your narrative and your way of viewing things. And that's something that we should be very concerned about across the globe. That said, I also don't think that absolute freedom in any regard is actually personally a valuable thing. Why? Because there need to be limits in place in order to prevent people using their freedom to infringe upon the freedom of others. Yeah. Right? This is the basic kind of liberal argument. I can do anything that doesn't infringe upon your freedom. There has to be certain guidelines in place. A perfect example of this is the United States and the U.S. press laws. You're allowed to say terrible, nasty things in various kinds of presses and various media. But the United States says there are limits to what you can say. You can say, I don't like this, or I don't like these folks, but you can't incite violence. You can't say that you're going to hurt them. You can't incite other people to hurt them, because you would be infringing upon their basic liberties by doing so.
Don't yell fire in a crowded theater, I think is the famous quote by one of the Supreme Court judges, or Supreme Court justices, I believe, which sounds like, but you see what's interesting in this, just as you say, you see this lack of social accountability because the current nominee for president right now, one of the current nominees for president, is on trial for inciting violence, and I was reading some of the updates on the case today, and it's looking as though the case is moving in a direction that can possibly be bad for the Trump. And those are just updates that I've read recently, but which is actually making me it's giving me some hope with this governance and this social accountability, because if the Supreme Court were to rule that Trump did not incite violence and they were to rule that he had no intention to manipulate the 2020, or excuse me, the 2020 election,
Mm-hmm.
then I think it would be a failure of this accountability mechanism
Mm-hmm.
and this democratic values that if we were to stray apart from, would be, as you say, an implosion of our society.
I agree. I mean, I think the power of a democratic culture is in the idea that democracy, at least the way I think of democracy, is I don't think of it as an ideology, as an ism. I think of it as the idea of rules for a game. There are a set of rules that have to be adhered to if the game is going to function.
Ah, yes.
If the society is going to function, right? And if at some point you say or make the case, and it is validated, that there are some people who don't have to play by those rules, that calls into question the very existence of the game, the very existence of that society. It's a radical thing to do. And, sadly, there are some people who try to do precisely that at various points in various ways, who do, in fact, believe that they are above the law, exempt from playing this, the same game as others according to the same rules. Some of them do so quite publicly. Some of them do so surreptitiously behind the scenes in one way or another. And this is something that corrodes our democratic foundations.
Social fabrics.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. So, speaking of the erosion of social fabrics and history, I would like to finally move into
The French Revolution.
the French Revolution and your area of study. So please, can you describe how you got interested in the French Revolution, how you got interested in historical France, and then we can start expanding from there, please.
It's actually an excellent segue. So this worked out well for us.
I've been doing this for a couple episodes now. I'm learning.
Oh, okay. Well, I figure I will, unto Caesar that which is Caesar. So, let you know that, given what my response will be, it's an excellent segue here. All historians, I think, write their biographies in some way. Now, I'm not the first person to say this. I wouldn't claim to have come up with this idea. It's something that becomes fairly obvious once you spend enough time in the profession, once you meet enough historians, and once you learn how their lives are related to what they study, the topics that they focus on. So what is my relationship to the French Revolution? I'm not a 300-year-old guy who would have been alive at the time. So presumably it's a little more of a roundabout, indirect connection. Well, I was raised in a family where things French were very important. They were very important almost in an unspoken way. It was like the air that we breathed. You don't really talk too much about it. You don't really think too much about it, but it's there, and it informs who you are to the point that it makes your existence possible. Now, that may seem like hyperbole, comparing French culture to the air that you breathe, right? Because air does quite literally make your existence possible, whereas you could exist without French culture in some sense.
Yes.
But in the history of my family, that's not true. We couldn't have existed without French culture, or at the very least, a certain strain and variety of French culture that was deeply rooted in revolutionary democracy. Now, this is not a tradition, political, culture, and otherwise that defines France in its entirety. France has often been described as almost like a person with split personalities. The great historian Alexis de Tocqueville described France as a place, and the French as a people who either they do one of two things: they either surpass your wildest expectations, or they disappoint you horribly, but they never leave you indifferent. And this is to a large extent true. A small plug: you should everybody out there who might see this should read Alexis de Tocqueville's work, whether it be on the United States or France. He was absolutely brilliant. So France has this, one tradition, partial tradition of revolutionary democracy that is associated with the support of the Republic. We're currently in a regime in France called the Fifth Republic. As that suggests, there have been a number of republics before that. The Fourth Republic, which was founded after World War II. You have the Third Republic, which existed from 1870 all the way up until the point when France is invaded by Nazi Germany in 1940. You have the Second Republic, which was a short-lived republic in the late 1840s, early 1850s. And then the First Republic, which existed from the early 1790s into the early 1800s. This was the republic that was founded by the Great French Revolution of 1789. This is the revolution with a capital R in many ways in French history and in French culture, right? It's kind of the ultimate reference point. Now, this revolutionary tradition associated with these republics was of vital importance in shaping France. It was a source of great contention, a source of great bitterness, conflict, violence, civil war in France at various times. Not surprisingly, because the republic viewed itself as largely secular, according to French definitions of secularism. It viewed itself as egalitarian in the sense of being meritocratic. People should be allowed to assume offices and perform functions on the basis of whether they have a capacity to do so well, as opposed to being born a nobleman, for example. It was also egalitarian in that it tended to think it wasn't a good idea to have kings and queens. It was secular in the sense that it didn't think it was a good idea to have an established church. Now, there were lots of people before the French Revolution in 1789 who liked the idea of the king and the queen, or who liked the idea of social privilege in the form of nobility, or who liked the idea of having an established church like the Catholic Church. And they didn't just suddenly disappear overnight. They remained there. They remained physically present in France, apart from those who could flee and who chose to flee the revolution. And this set up really a century of conflict that would see France lurching between political regimes. A republic, the First Republic, then basically an empire, right, under Napoleon Bonaparte.
Of course.
Then you have a monarchical restoration, a restoration of a king and queen, basically from 1850 up to 1830. Then there's a slightly more liberal constitutional monarchy that takes place after another revolution from 1830 to 1848. Then you have the Second Republic. Then you have the Second Empire. Then you have the Third Republic, so on and so forth. So France is a place that basically had been, engaged in a century-long civil war, really. It's more than a century, 150 years from the French Revolution up to essentially World War II, at which point, and I think this is a good thing, a lot of those other traditions and those other types of political regimes, which tended to be more authoritarian, were fundamentally discredited because of the fact that they and some of their adherents found it possible and were willing to work with Nazi Germany. Right? So how does this relate to me and who I am?
There we go.
Right? My family came to France under the Third Republic. We were Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe. And my grandmother was born in Poland, but her brothers were born in France. They left Poland sometime in the 1920s and came to France during that period, somewhere between 1926 and 1929, which was kind of peak Third Republic. This was a moment of incredible kind of openness in France, politically. Certainly, it was a democracy. Culturally also, though, there were laws in place that were very pro-immigration and pro-immigrant, not because the French were particularly, hospitable, but because they needed people. They needed people because of World War I, because of the death toll. There was a lack of young men, a lack of people to work and to have kids and have families and that kind of stuff. And so that created liberal immigration laws, essentially. Now, this just so happened to coincide with the rise of anti-Semitism, of early forms of kind of fascism, throughout large portions of Eastern Europe, pogroms, anti-Jewish murders and riots and things like that. And so my family left during that period. And we remained in France. We remained in France up through World War II, and most of my mother's family still lives in France. We came to France for a number of reasons. Of course, there was this issue of openness and opportunity, economic opportunity, that came with, going to a place with a stronger economy and more, business and enterprise and that kind of stuff. But we were also attracted to France because of its democratic traditions, because of those democratic institutions, and because of the democratic culture that was starting to take root there. That said, being a citizen of France or being a Frenchman isn't about race or religion. It isn't about your ethnic background. It's about, do you subscribe to certain values? Do you agree to play the rules of the game? Do you espouse these democratic principles, this democratic culture? Do you want to be French? The French, under their democratic regimes, had what is known as a civic nationalism. And this was, for people like my family, an extremely liberating thing, because it gave them the possibility, in some sense, to experience freedom with the idea of not constantly being reminded that they're racially, ethnically, religiously other, different, excluded, in some sense. Now, this was a fragile contribution that the French made to kind of political culture. It was challenged, most notably with the French collaborationist government during World War II and the persecution of Jews. But there were lots of French people who had imbibed these values and who had accepted them and who had made them a part of who they were. And these French people were instrumental in saving the lives of 75% of France's Jews. During World War II, including my family. And so this is what I mean when I say it's, in a sense, not hyperbole to talk about how French culture was the air that we breathed. Because without France and a certain vision of France, we would not be alive. I would not be alive. And this all goes back to that French Revolution in many ways, back to 1789.
Right. It's so amazing to me how this obviously takes a little bit of historical understanding, and you have to correct me if I'm wrong, but the French Revolution was partly a reaction to the failure of King Louis XIV's government to
16.
There you go. See, I knew I needed.
There are lots of Louis.
I knew
I
knew I needed to be corrected somewhere. King Louis XVI's failure to economically to have economic protections for the nation, and you saw, and you see what is interesting is it was almost it was an attempt at empire building that Manuel Covo, actually a historian here, outlines this in his book Entrepots of Revolution very well. He talks about how the French Revolution and the involvement in the American independence was really partly inspired by the desire to protect their Caribbean assets as well. And so you see that being, you see the desire for empire building being translated into this revolution because of the failure at the empire building and the failure of economic support in the nation. But then this empire building, through all of these different interactions, leads to Professor David Moak being able to talk about being able to be alive and being able to talk about this French Revolution which occurred.
Yeah, I mean, it's all connected.
It's all connected.
I mean, I don't recognize the empire as part of my cultural and intellectual lineage.
I didn't mean to say that,
but I understand your point that, and a historian of revolution will be the first person to say revolution is something that is deeply contingent. It's all well and good to say that, again, there are ideas, there are abstractions, whether they be democratic or socialist or, whatever it might be, that come to, inform a revolution, maybe even define it and its political content in some sense. But all revolution is dependent on a certain degree of contingency chance, a kind of coalition of factors and alignment of stars in some sense that often lead to a moment of intense destabilization. Right, in the case of France, that is the bankruptcy of the monarchy that comes largely from global wars, particularly against the British. The French, finances are already in shambles by the 1750s as a result of what the Europeans generally call the 7 Years' War.
Yes.
We know it here in the U.S. as the French and Indian War. And the French are defeated by the British Empire during there are other opponents, but that's the primary enemy. And this is one of the things that motivates the French to take the side of the American colonists. They're basically thinking it's time for us to get our revenge. Right? It's time for us to get our revenge. But also, among other things, in getting their revenge, thinking about how they can weaken the British Empire so that it doesn't threaten, French colonial possessions, particularly in the Caribbean, like Saint-Domingue, Haiti, which was incredibly wealthy and a big moneymaker for the French. So this is part of the story of the French Revolution, right? As is the, the threatened famine by that is related to this little ice age, the fact that people couldn't get bread, or if they could, it was really expensive. And they had to worry about feeding themselves, and they had to worry about whether it would be possible to survive, a winter. This is another thing that, that part of that contingency that goes into explaining why folks were angry, why they were upset, and why they were willing to go to the streets.
Right.
Because, the average person in Paris, particularly, lower class person, who was, a day laborer or an artisan, was either illiterate, or if they were literate, it was at a fairly low level. They weren't out there, sort of reading philosophical tracts. They weren't out there engaging in, typically, what we would consider to be, arcane, abstract political debates about ideas like democracy. They were motivated by their bellies.
Thank you, Thomas Paine, for writing Common Sense.
Yes. That all goes into making me who I am, making my life possible in some sense, which is an interesting thing to think about, how much our existences are built on contingency.
Yes, actually, that brings me to the next topic. However, I would like to call in a little ad break here. So we're going to take a 10-minute break. I would like you guys to enjoy this ad that we're going to roll. Thank you very much. I'm Neil Harder, joined by Professor David Moak. This is Farm Boy Meets the World. We'll be back soon.
One humongous meal later.
Hello, everyone. My name is Neil Harder. You have joined me back again on Farm Boy Meets the World. I am joined by Professor David Moak. If you just watched that ad, welcome back. The last thing we spoke about was how Professor Moak's trajectory of his entire life and even the existence of his life was affected by the revolution in France. And I wanted to talk much more about the revolution in France, but I also wanted to talk about how the revolution affected other people as well. And we can talk about a prime example, which you brought up in class, is Haiti. Mm-hmm. Can we talk a little bit about how your studies have illuminated what the effect of the French Revolution has been on Haiti, and maybe some of those other things that aren't typically thought about at the forefront of this type of subject?
Mm-hmm. I mean, the issue of Saint-Domingue, Haiti, and the Haitian Revolution as it relates to France is very complex. I think, if you had to sort of sum up in a sentence or two what it signifies or what it teaches us about the French Revolution, it would be this, that no matter how beautiful in the abstract ideas are and how generous people may be in certain contexts with those ideas, I'm thinking about, notions of equality, for example, this idea of a civic definition of citizenship and nationhood, that nevertheless they have blind spots where they're being affected still by prejudice or bigotry of some kind. Mm-hmm. And this is absolutely true of the French revolutionaries. There were French revolutionaries who were mobilizing and working for the abolition of slavery. Mm-hmm. But there were others who were not particularly concerned with this issue, who viewed it as perfectly possible to have a revolutionary democratic regime that espoused ideas of equality in France while still having colonies in the Caribbean where slavery existed.
Voltaire, for example. He switched it later on, though.
Yeah, plenty of folks, legislators, philosophers of all kinds, were capable of reconciling these two things in their heads. And, that was true of the United States as well. I mean, the famous example of Thomas Jefferson, all of his, wonderful rhetoric about, equality and liberty and freedom and all that sort of stuff, and yet he's a slave owner. So what is it that the Haitian Revolution does is it forces the French revolutionaries to acknowledge the logical outcome of those values that they were espousing, to confront that contradiction that they were kind of living with. Namely, how can you say that you're founding a new world based on revolutionary values of equality and things like that when you're treating people as property? And it's the slaves of Haiti who rise up and force this issue. They force the sort of French revolutionaries back in Paris to pay attention, and ultimately they present the slaves. They present these legislators with a sort of very simple choice. They basically through their actions pose this question: do you wish to lose the colony entirely, which is what will happen if you don't go along with us in our projects to abolish slavery, or you abolish slavery? Right. And that's ultimately the choice that the French revolutionaries made in 1794. They didn't want to lose Saint-Domingue, Haiti, and so these revolutionaries abolished slavery and sided with the slave rebels. And so again, ideas are important, but they're not everything. There's the issue of contingency. There's the issue of war and global kind of population transfers and all this other kind of stuff that goes into explaining why certain decisions are made, why certain outcomes are achieved. Whereas there might have been a totally different outcome had things kind of looked differently.
Right. What's interesting about that is you see a different reaction coming from France and from the United States, because Thomas Jefferson, I think, actually was the if I'm mistaken, please let me know, the president, one of the presidents in power during the entire process of the French Revolution and during the Haitian Revolution.
Yeah, he was a Francophile. He was a lover of France because he viewed France as a counterpoint to Britain. Yeah. Because of course, as we all know, the Britain tries to reconquer the colonies and War of 1812 and that kind of stuff. So there was a faction of early kind of leaders in the early United States who were Francophiles.
Right, but what's unfortunate, though, is you see in France the demand for the end of slavery actually culminate in the end of slavery, in the abolition of slavery temporarily. But then in the United States, you don't see that reaction. And you don't even see the United States supporting Haiti at all, for example. And this is because Thomas Jefferson is aware that a Haitian revolution may very much lead to an American slave revolution as well. And so what do you think about that duality there, in the sense that France, that the failure of the United States to address the issue? But actually, I think what I'm trying to say is that you can see the direct responsibility that France had in that situation. The dynamic is different because the French people, the French government had a direct responsibility and leg, I guess you can say, in that entire in the region, right?
Yeah. So I would reiterate something that you said in passing. The French abolition is temporary. Slavery is abolished in 1794. Subsequently, under Napoleon Bonaparte, it is reestablished, and the French actually attempt to reconquer Saint-Domingue, Haiti, basically restore plantation slavery as it existed before the French Revolution. And this is the thing that ultimately leads to the Haitian Declaration of Independence. The French are defeated, and Haiti, decides to go its own way. But the French actually are successful in reimposing slavery in other places. In the Caribbean, for example, there are the islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe that are French territories until today. And slavery existed there from the reestablishment all the way up until 1848. Which is the birth of the Second Republic, which is when slavery is definitively abolished by France. So it's important to keep that in mind. But you're right. There's at least in temporary terms a kind of different outcome. Now, is it because the French revolutionaries were more loyal to their or faithful to their ideas and their values related to things like equality and democracy? I'm not sure. I don't think that that's an argument that we could really make, or what would the evidence for that look like? You can't see into people's souls and sort of understand them in the present, let alone a few hundred years after the fact.
Right.
I actually read the different outcomes in terms of kind of practical political dynamic. The French were forced again to abolish slavery in 1794 because, among other things, of the incredible demographic imbalance in Saint-Domingue, Haiti.
Right.
You have 500,000 slaves slash former slaves now, Haitian revolutionaries who are facing off against, what was, I don't know, something like 30,000, maybe, if you take the gens de couleur and the white planter class and the poor whites together, it's incredible imbalance. There's no way that France could win a war against 500,000 people rising up in revolt if the kind of colonists they had on the ground, or the people who were loyal to the old kind of slave plantation system, represented only 15,000 people on the island. Right. It's one thing to send over an army, but that takes time. These soldiers are also not familiar with the landscape. They're not used to the climate. Many of the French soldiers die from disease as a result of things like malaria and yellow fever, that sort of stuff.
And not to mention, these revolutionaries are soldiers in and of themselves that have been taken, some of them, not all of them, but because some have been born there, right? But some of them are soldiers taken from Africa. So
absolutely. So they don't just have the incredible demographic kind of upper hand of being 500,000 strong versus maybe 15 to 30,000, but they also, as you rightly point out, many of them are people from backgrounds, either themselves or their parents, who were brought into slavery because they were soldiers fighting in wars in West Africa, and so there were people who had experience fighting, particularly what we would call nowadays informal warfare. Who were more than capable of fending off French attacks and defeating French forces, whether they were helped by malaria, the yellow fever, or not. So it was, this is why I say I don't think it's about the French being more faithful to values in some sense. I think it's ultimately for them an issue of practicality. Yeah. But the situation was reversed in the colonies that would become the United States. Slavery, looked a little bit different. The demographic imbalance was not anything like what existed in Haiti, where you had, the vast majority of the population consisting of slaves and then just a tiny little sort of portion of a white planter class. And for that reason, there was more of an ability to kind of, resist on the part of, white colonists, and then subsequently white, early Americans, resist any kind of pressure for, liberation or reform of slavery, because they didn't feel as threatened demographically. Or even when there was threats, or when there were threats, as was the case, there's a kind of hardening of slavery in the United States after the Haitian Revolution, because people are scared. Right. Nevertheless, they were able to kind of the white kind of planter class to contain things in a way that wouldn't have been possible in Haiti, because of just how imbalanced demographically things were over there. So personally, that's how I read the kind of different responses and different outcomes. It's not that the French were more idealistic or more or less bigoted or racist than early Americans. It was that they were on the ground working in very different conditions. Right.
I understand. That does make sense. I do want to take a little bit of a gear switch here. Thank you for answering that question so aptly. I want to talk about Nice because it's your area of particular study. We touched on it a little bit before, but it's part of your area of study in particular. I think you published your dissertation about the tourism in Nice. Is that correct? Right. I read a little bit of it, but I would really be interested in hearing the oral version. And but I also wanted to talk about what? Let's if you're ready, I'd like to transition a little bit more into Nice. Can you just kind of talk to me about that?
Well,
it's a little bit broad, but
no, perfect. I was just going to attack that question from two angles. First of all, going back to sort of our discussion of the French Revolution and why I study it, that it's a personal kind of history. This is also true of the city of Nice. So the majority of my mother's family lives in and around Paris until today. But during World War II, France is divided. between an occupied northern zone that is directly controlled by Nazi Germany and a southern zone that is controlled by the Vichy government, which is a collaborationist government that works with the Nazis, collaborates with them, as the word would suggest, but that is not as virulently anti-Semitic. It is anti-Semitic, but it does not have, in my opinion, quite the same kind of exterminatory racism that exists in a place like Nazi Germany. This means that when the Nazis invade, a lot of Jews head south, whoever can,
Logically.
And many of them end up going to Nice, because Nice actually is occupied by the Italians of Mussolini's Italy, another fascist state that is allied with Nazi Germany. Now, you may be asking why that is. The fascists in Italy were anti-Semitic. There was plenty of anti-Semitism there, plenty of racism, but it wasn't the thing that they were most interested in. Anti-Semitism, racism was something that was much more a characteristic, a kind of foundational, fundamental element ideologically of Nazism as a specific variety of fascism. In Italy, fascism tended to kind of focus on other groups sometimes. There was anti-Semitism, sure, but it wasn't exterminatory. It was just about kind of excluding Jews. I mean, that's still bad, of course, but it's not threatening their lives. And the Italian fascists were actually, in many instances, much more interested in persecuting communists, who they viewed as their ideological kind of enemies.
Yeah,
right?
I see.
And so this meant that, ironically enough, being under Italian occupation was pretty safe for a lot of Jews. And Nice was controlled by the Italians for a few years. And so lots of Jews end up going there, including my family. And we survive World War II essentially in Nice. I don't know exactly at what point we head down there, but we are there all the way up through 1945, 44, the liberation of France. And initially speaking, I don't know if this is true of the entire time, but we're hidden by friends who we know from Paris, who have a place down there, and kind of provide a cover essentially for us.
Wow, yeah.
Yeah. So there is this personal connection. Yet again, I've been going to Nice since I was a little boy for that reason. But I'm also interested in Nice from just a kind of purely academic perspective. Nice is a fascinating place because it gave birth to what we would call tourism. Now, again, that may seem like something relatively unimportant, but hop onto your computer and Google some basic kind of information about national economies, across the globe. Developed countries, very wealthy like France, or less developed, or poor. Tourism is a massive, massive economic sector.
Yeah.
In large portions of the globe, it is of vital economic importance, and relatively few people have ever bothered to take it seriously and sort of ask how it came to be, why it exists, what exactly its history is. There are some, of course, among historians, but they tend to focus on a later period, kind of the late 1800s, early 1900s. There are also, a lot of anthropologists and sociologists, not a lot, but a good number, I should say, who have focused on tourism, but it's been relatively neglected, particularly among historians, and particularly among historians who work on an earlier period. And so this was kind of what was motivating my project. I'm going to sort of investigate the origins of this phenomenon that would subsequently become of fundamental importance, not just in Europe or in the economy of a state like France, but in the economies of places across the globe. And so my project really focuses on the late 1700s and early 1800s. And in particular, in the early 1800s, I argue this is the moment where tourism as a kind of phenomenon really starts to coalesce and come into being in a major way. Nice is this place on the Mediterranean that is kind of at the crossroads of a bunch of traditions of leisure, kind of elite leisure
Yeah,
in some
actually,
sense.
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, it's fine. There's sort of the traditions of taking the waters, going to places like Bath or Spa. These are actually the names of places in Europe, where people would go to take the waters, bathe and drink the water for medicinal purposes, but they were linked also to leisure.
Yeah.
There was sea bathing as well, which kind of grew out of the spa sort of tradition and the bath tradition of taking the waters. There was a sort of alpinism that emerged around the same time in the late 1700s in places like Austria, France, Switzerland, Germany. And then finally, there was the tradition of the Grand Tour. And this is actually where the word tourist comes from. This is the origin of that word. The Grand Tour was something that existed, going back to kind of the 1600s. It was common as part of a sort of elite young man's education to spend, a year or so in Italy. Italy was seen as, a place of high culture, art. Obviously, it had this sort of legacy of Roman civilization. This was something that was very attractive among elite circles. And so, young men from noble families or who wanted to go into government or diplomacy would typically do what was called a grand tour of Italy, going to the major cities, Genoa, Pisa, Venice, Naples,
Turin.
All of these sorts of places, right? And so Nice is kind of a place where all of these traditions get melded together. You have the sea bathing; it's the Mediterranean. You have the Alpine, right? It's the name of the department that Nice is the capital of in France is called the Alpes Maritimes, the Maritime Alps. So you have the Mediterranean Sea, you have the Alps right there. And it is also kind of the gateway to Italy in some sense. It is a sort of vaguely Italianate place.
Right.
And so all of these things come together, right, to create Nice in some sense, which emerges as a city that is of importance globally precisely because of how popular it becomes as a destination for all of these kind of elite leisure seekers in the early 1800s. And so this is kind of what my dissertation is concerned with, is interested in. And I, again, use it to talk about big issues, right? First of all, again, how tourism is created and why that's important, but also what is tourism? Tourism is an incredibly advanced form of capitalism. This is kind of my argument. It's about the commodification of a series of abstractions, the commodification of peoples, ethnos, in that sense, a kind of ethnic group, a commodification of their history, a commodification of nature and urban space. And this, again, may seem very abstract, but think about it.
Oh, yeah.
We're here in Santa Barbara. We can use Santa Barbara as an example. Do you think all of those palm trees that we're going to see when we walk out of this studio are indigenous to Santa Barbara?
No.
They're not.
No.
They're brought here because they are important in cultivating an image for people who want to come here to consume, an image of a paradise in some sense, right? And this is exactly what happens in Nice. There's this kind of process of image making and mythologizing that goes on. Again, kind of shaping visions of the ethnic kind of people living there, the ethnos, shaping visions of their history, shaping the natural world, shaping the urban space, all with the idea of transforming this place into a consumer good that is going to be packaged and sold to sort of wealthy out-of-towners, noblemen, noble women who are traveling from modern-day Britain and Germany, the Netherlands, you name it, and who are coming to this place to experience, this sort of this kind of mythological. I don't know how I should describe it exactly. This sort of mythological, playland or plaything. This place where they can live out fantasies in some way, right?
Oh, I see what you're saying.
And this is what tourism fundamentally does in everywhere where it takes root. It allows us, because of the scale, to see how capitalism functions, how consumer goods are actually made, services are made. Sure, there's the good itself, and sure, there's the service itself. But actually, what's often just as important is the kind of mythology that's being consumed along with it, right? Or the kind of, values that are being consumed along with it. You know what I mean? So think about, an Instagram influencer when they go to some place, they're there maybe to kind of consume certain goods and services, but they're also there because of the kind of mythologies and values that it allows them to appropriate and communicate to others through their, let's say Instagram post where they're, taking that picture in front of the beach and, living their best life and kind of projecting these values onto the world.
Right.
This is in many ways just as important, if not more important, than the actual goods and services that they're consuming in that location. They want the world to see them through the lens of these kinds of these mythologies of kind of paradise and luxury and leisure and all that kind of stuff.
Interesting. Okay, so I have to be completely honest. We have about 4 minutes left.
Sure.
Let me say a few things. It sounds so similar to pilgrimage in some senses. The commodification by a religious entity in some ways of a place. So similar. I'm finding parallels. I think that and later on, when I have more time to ponder this in my brain, I'm definitely going to consider that avenue. But now that we have just a few minutes left, I really wanted to ask you, and it sounds like this what you're describing now is probably going to be very similar to the next answer that you're going to give me. But I want to ask it anyways, and I want to know what do you want your contribution to be to global studies, to the field of history? You're a young scholar, although older than I, but certainly still relatively a young scholar. You have a lot to offer this academia. So what are those things that you're prepared to offer that you would like to offer?
So, I mean, I have, fantasies. I want to be producing books. I'm working on one right now that's under contract, so that's good. I want these books to speak to things that are important to me, but that are also answering big questions, big issues that, again, folks can put down after reading and hopefully, leave that book thinking, wow, I hadn't really thought about this thing in that way, right. Or, that helps me understand, why something like this functions that way, or, like that they can take with them out into life, right. and use it to understand the world that they're living in. And I think this is why when you do a PhD in history or whatever else, it's called a doctorate of philosophy, because whether we're studying history or anthropology or sociology or chemistry or whatever it is, fundamentally we're concerned with these big kind of philosophical issues of understanding our world and hopefully communicating that understanding or a piece of it to other people through writing. So that's something, obviously that I very much hope to be able to do at some point. The other thing is I just really want to keep teaching. I really enjoy being in the classroom. I enjoy the idea of helping students cultivate a confidence in their own ability to think, reason, generate knowledge. Because it's important for that kind of confidence to be passed on from generation to generation. And to instill in people not just the desire to think, right, dare to know, going back to Immanuel Kant, but the confidence in themselves to know that they're capable of it, and that their first kind of duty as a people trying to live in a world that hopefully is just and kind to as many people as possible is to think, right. And to apply their reason to understanding others and understanding what they're going through and understanding how, we can sort of improve as a people, as a species, really.
You guys heard it here from Professor David Moak. That concludes our interview, guys. That was an abrupt ending, but duty calls. Time is time. It doesn't stop for anyone. What will stop though is this podcast. I will see you guys next time. My name is Neil Harder, aka the Farm Boy. I am joined by Professor David Moak. That was our podcast. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Oh, yes.
All right.
I love doing this. I love doing this.
Okay. That was fun.
It was fun, right?
Yeah, I enjoy it.